Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman. Jeff Fawcett and I come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health and the environment.
It shouldn't surprise you to hear me say that I believe wireless technologies harm your health because they rely on non-ionizing radiation. We've covered a good deal of the science and politics of this issue on this show, and while we'd like to see the science acknowledged and responsible organizations, both public and private, take appropriate action, it's not likely much good will happen soon. That leaves us on our own to protect ourselves as best we can. Luckily, a new book is available to help with that. My guest today is Daniel DeBaun, author with his son Ryan DeBaun of Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology. Daniel's concern for the health risks of EMF exposures comes from his 30 years of experience as an engineer and manager in the telecommunications industry, where he held leadership and executive positions at a variety of companies such as AT&T and Bell Labs. He is also the inventor of an EMF protection technology used on electronic devices. Dan DeBaun, welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness.
Dr. Jeff, thanks so much for inviting me. I really, really do appreciate sharing some of the things we've learned over the last few years with your audience.
Great. And you don't need to put a doctor in front of my name. It's okay. Just Jeff. It's fine.
I like to start that way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll see how it ends.
Right.
So you worked, the first thing that strikes me is that you worked as an engineer in the telecommunications industry, and the first thing that pops into my head, as it may with other people, is a less harmful technology possible?
Yes, Jeff. There are actually simple ways of, it's not new technology in some ways, and some of it is new. But if you think about it, when you have an exposure from an emitting source, like, for example, your cell phone, and you turn off and put it in airplane mode, you're actually turning off the transmitter that potentially is endangering you. So there are some technology being evolved where Wi-Fi routers will automatically turn off transmitters when not in use. So those technologies are beginning to enter into the marketplace. It's right now tertiary markets that it's finding its way into, but I'm hoping it becomes prime markets in time. Other things that are going on, of course, is the optical stuff. They do optical transmission. It's a light that connects from one source to the other, and those technologies eliminate potential dangers from the technologies that are around us every day. So, yeah, there are a few things that are coming out that may help.
That's really good to know. Now, you begin your book with a story about what got your attention, focused on this issue about EMF health risks. Could you share that story with us?
Yes, Jeff, I'd love to. It turns out 4 or 5 years ago, we had our sons visiting us, and they had their laptops in their laps hours at a time. And my wife looked at it and said, "This can't be good. I want grandchildren." And I thought about it for a second, and I realized there are emitting sources. There's several different types there, and that you're right, having proximity so close to the very soft tissues of the body was dangerous. So we went to try to buy something that actually could provide protection, and we couldn't find it. So we built them. It turns out when I was in Bell Labs, I don't know if you recall, there was a transatlantic cable that ran across many years ago.
Yep.
And there were metals that were created, alloys that were created to shield the wiring across the oceans. I actually took some of that technology and I applied it into the products we did for my sons. And then their friends and their friends' friends wanted some, and so all of a sudden I got drawn into this marketplace because my wife wanted grandchildren.
Good for her.
Right. And she's not a science-based expert. There was an intuitive belief in her thinking that these kinds of things just can't be good for you. And it turns out that is a lot of the moms, a lot of the grandmas actually have that intuition. They don't need to know the facts, but there's sort of an intuitive understanding in those kinds of people. And that's why we wrote the book, because they're the ones who are the decision makers and protecting the families. So we try to focus our information towards the people who really need to know the problems and what those problems are.
Yes, and I'll just say I'm kind of anticipating some issues we'll talk about, but it seems to me that is exactly the shape of where the discussion should be, and not housed in a technical discussion, but of really addressing concerns that ordinary people have with these issues, people who are not going to spend endless hours reviewing research as you have done, and to some extent as I have done, to make decisions about those kinds of exposures. So good for you. And the other thing that occurred to me about your engineering and telecommunications background is to wonder whether the emergence of the science over the last, well, actually, it's the science that's been critical of these technologies has been around for quite a while, 50 years or so. But whether there's been a shift in the engineering profession as to the seriousness of these issues, particularly the issue around thermal effects of non-ionizing radiation and non-thermal effects.
It turns out what we're talking about are emissions that are generated by technology all around us, and because of the frequency range they're in, they're known as a thermal emission. In other words, they hit your body, it heats up. And oftentimes, there's no real biological understanding of long-term impacts. And so, to your point, I haven't seen the engineering side of the industry building the products that are delivered to us becoming more aware that they need to be cautious on how they develop products to minimize dangers. I haven't seen that. And in a way, if you look at the cycle of technologies or anything that enters our lives, it takes time for society's engineering through end users to get a handle on what it is and then take a reaction to it. But they actually can solve those problems. It's just that they're not business drivers to drive those changes, and it won't happen until there's basically a response by the consumer base saying, "Hey, this is serious stuff. We have to fix it."
You should
I haven't seen.
You should have your wife talk to them.
Yeah, exactly. She wants grandchildren. She'll make sure they understand that as a leading concern. Did you know 25% of the male sperm after only 3-4 hours is immobile?
Yes.
And when you go to a doctor and say, doctor, I can't have children, a fertility doctor, he'll say, the first thing he says is, do you have a laptop near your lap? Do you have a cell phone near your? These are modern day questions that are emerging, yet there seems to be a disconnect between all the silos addressing these kinds of things.
Well, it does seem that this is anecdotal information, but it does seem to me that the medical profession, people in the medical professions, are becoming more sensitive to this issue than they were 20 years ago. And that I'm surprised, I'm pleased and surprised that fertility doctors are going to that place of immediately asking, what kind of exposures have your soft tissues been exposed to?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that leads me to kind of get to the. I want to get to the meat of your or one of the meaty parts of your book, Radiation Nation, which you focus on 5 technologies that are particularly significant with regard to health effects and exposures, although you talk about other kinds of exposures. You focus on these 5 technologies. So if you could kind of summarize for us what those 5 technologies are, why each is significant in terms of health risks, and what a person can do to lower those risks.
Okay, so in our environment, if you go back 30 years when I was in Bell Laboratories, and you think about that environment at that time, there was mainframes that were 500 feet away, huge transformers, large fans, big buses, all generating emissions in a room. But I wasn't on top of it. It was 500 feet away from me, and it was wired into my office. Fast forward today, the capacity of that machine is now in my lap. It's still emitting emissions that can be dangerous, and that's why over the last 30 years there's been such a shift in technologies in a good way, to actually become making part of our integral part of our lives, but there's a consequence of that, and that goes to the point you were just asking about, which is what are the most harmful, and how do you deal with it? Well, the most harmful is the stuff that's closest to your body, and I often like to point out we're not victims. Some things we can fix, but I focus on what can be fixed to solve the problem that you can take actions to fix. And when you're in an office environment and you have transmitters in a room, there's not much you can do about it. But when you're in your own environment, you actually can say, I can control them. So what does that mean? A laptop, they have a connection to a Wi-Fi. They emit extremely low frequency emissions, which is another form of emissions. They have the capacity to do a Bluetooth transmitter. And so you begin looking at these separate sources of emissions that can come out of the laptop. It also comes out of a cell phone. The difference is that the laptop's in your lap, the cell phone's to your brain. And of course, if we continue, you have the tablets, so we have like the laptop, cell phone, tablets, and Wi-Fi. And the last is the meters in our environment. They're getting closer to us. The smart meters are being attached to our houses. If a smart meter is attached to the outside of your bedroom and you put your head close to where that meter is, then it starts interfering potentially with of course, your head. And sleeping. It screws around with your melatonin. The process of creating melatonin is now interfered. So the things I talk about is the stuff that's closest to us and things we can do about it. And believe it or not, some of the best things to do is just put distance between you and it. It's a logarithmic drop off of power levels. So you walk away from it a little bit, but by 4 foot, 98% of the danger's gone.
I need to take, so I apologize for interrupting, but I need to ID the show. You're listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking with Dan DeBaun about his book, Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology and How to Limit Health Risks from EMF Exposures. So, continue on talking about this issue of the 5 most significant technologies, how they affect health, and what a person can do to reduce those risks.
Yeah, what I was mentioning before, Jeff, is that there are actually very simple ways to mitigate those concerns of potentially dangers, and that, of course, is distance. When you're 1 foot away, 80% of an emission from the devices that are closest to our body, 80% of the danger is gone by 4 foot 98. It's a logarithmic power level function drop. And so if you use your cell phone, Jeff, and you're using it for 5 minutes, you don't have to worry. You're not going to die. Those emissions are not most likely producing long-term damage to the cells they're hitting because the duration of that time is not very long. It's only when it's beginning to get saturated over many hours. For example, the laptop my boys were using on their lab for 3-4 hours at a time was killing off 25% of the mobile sperm. And of course, there are equivalents to that for the female impacts as well. So you want to think about putting distance and limiting time associated with it. And of course, you can also shield yourself, and those are a discussion at a later time maybe about products that may be able to do that for you as well.
You include in your book Radiation Nation a discussion of exposures that distinguishes between extremely low frequency and radio frequency radiation, and we kind of lump them together as EMF, electromagnetic, EMR, electromagnetic radiation. But what I'd like you to do is talk about the distinction between ELF and the health risks of each of those frequencies.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. When you look at the frequency spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, on the far right, which means the really, really small and really, really powerful frequencies are around the X-ray, gamma ray. Those are called ionized radiation. Ionized radiation takes an atom and knocks the electron out of its path, rotating around the neutron. What that does then is it charges the cell and makes it positive. That's what makes it an ionized radiation. But there are two others on that spectrum which are on the lower side, and that's the extreme low frequency stuff and the RF microwave. And that's what we focus on. The RF microwave, for those who don't know it, it is the microwave signal going into your microwave oven that's heating up the water in between the cells of the meat, oscillating those cells to the point where they heat it up and it's cooked. So when you talk about an RF, a radio frequency signal, and a microwave signal, they're one and the same. The only difference is the power levels are much, much lower on an RF signal. But an RF signal is a thermal emitting transmitted signal, which not only will have a long-term biological impact, but it will also heat up the cells. Real quick jump forward, the FCC standards only refers to the thermal emitting impact, not the biological. So let's get back to the spectrum. If we go to the far left of the spectrum, most of what we see in extremely low frequency stuff is at 60 hertz. What does that mean? When you were in school, Jeff, you took a pair of wires. You had a battery, you took a pair of wires, and wrapped it around a nail, and you found out it was magnetized. That is an electromagnetic emission that's coming out of that nail, and that's on the the 300 hertz or below side of the spectrum. And most of that is really like when you have a toaster and you're cooking your toast, it's probably about 150 milligauss is what they call it, a measure of the energy level into the room. It could be your hairdryer, 100 and 150 milligauss, which, by the way, is a lot of milligauss. The motor on your refrigerator, that's probably 50 milligauss. The electricity in the wall, when there's a current flow with any device, energy is building up around the wire in your house. But those emissions are very low. They're 3-5 mellogauss. So you tend not to worry about those extremely low frequency emissions, but you do worry a little bit more when you talk about 100, 150 milligauss. Now, because a dryer's only 5, 10, 15 minutes, durations are short, exposures are short, so you tend not to worry about it. But if you're sitting next to a hair dryer running a half an hour at a time, keeping your feet warm, that actually starts representing an exposure that you got to consider. Now, our current technologies, laptops, tablets, all of them emit extremely low frequency emissions under 300 hertz. And they issue RF signals / microwave. And in a laptop's case or a cell phone case, you have Bluetooth. You have Wi-Fi. You have the cellular connection. And if you think about it, the cellular connection goes 3 to 5 miles. The Wi-Fi goes 400 or 500 feet. The Bluetooth goes 30 to 50 feet, depending on the technology. And so the power levels are less. With the cell phone is the most, Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth is the least. But they're all RF signals / microwave signals, all thermally emitting signals. Cutting to the chase, if you have a cell phone and you're using it and you want to reduce the impact of those multiple transmitters, turn off your Bluetooth. Turn off your Wi-Fi. You're not using it. And that's reducing potential exposures that can impact the body.
So I have two questions. One has to do with just the relationship in terms of how the machinery works. That I think we're pretty clear that the RF is associated with the wireless communication part of the device, and the ELF, the extremely low frequency, is associated with the operation of from the integrated circuits that are part of the electronics.
You think of it, Jeff, as anytime there's current flow, there's emissions, extremely low frequency emissions. So
they, in a way, they come together, so that turning off the Bluetooth, turning off the Wi-Fi capability in a cell phone both reduces the microwave emissions, the RF emissions, but it also reduces the ELF emissions. Is that correct?
No, it doesn't actually, because the current flow is not changed. And that's a really good point, Jeff, that you're making. If you fix one and not the other, you're still having, relatively speaking, the similar exposure. You can't cut one out and not the other and be safe without cutting the other. To that point, this research shows us that there are various impacts to these exposures, which we will talk about in a bit. But what's clear from science is that there's also equally as important impacts to exposure to ELF, and they're serious. In fact, Cindy Sage is a person that's been in this business for a while. You may know her.
Yes.
She identified 30 years ago that exposure of 15 milligauss increases the probability of a pregnant woman having a miscarriage 3 times. And that was pretty serious stuff, and we knew that 30 years ago.
Yeah. My jaw kind of drops when I hear things like that. So we've known this for 30 years, and the FCC standards have. But anyway, to kind of summarize what you said, because I don't think people, listeners may not have picked this up, but let me repeat that the emissions that are coming from electronic devices, and this is my understanding, any electronic device that has an integrated circuit is going to emit extremely low frequency radiation. And in addition to that, if the device is something that communicates using microwaves, it will also be emitting radio frequency radiations. And each of those types of radiations have their own kind of health risk profile. Is that that accurate?
Yes. It's funny when we look at the research, we tend not to modulate the power levels to be able to determine specific levels and impacts. It's more generalized, but each one of them does generate an emission, and those emissions can vary depending on their source.
Well, in terms of,
but I like, you were talking a minute ago about, how you were sort of lamenting about, we've known this for a while. I always tell the story about when I was 12 years old, which was quite a number of years ago. I smoked cigarettes because I wanted to be a big man, and I thought at that time it would be a perfect way to show it. Turns out that at that time there was virtually no common knowledge in the industry that said there was a danger in smoking a cigarette and it was related to cancer. Nothing like that. In fact, in 1978, I recall an interview with the head of Philip Morris. He was in front of a bank of doctors, and the doctors asked him, if a woman smokes a cigarette, does that impact the pregnant woman's baby? And he reacted and he said, absolutely not. There's no impact whatsoever, but she may get a baby that's smaller. And what woman wouldn't want a smaller baby? So if you think about that mentality at that time and you fast forward to today, how could you ever have said something like that and anybody believe you? Well, that's sort of what's going on here a little bit too. There's cycles in technology when we have advances, and there are lags that occur on the use of those, and we don't know much. And remember my story about Bell Labs. 30, 40 years ago, a mainframe was 500 miles away, 500 feet away from me. It was not a problem in our society. It's only 10 years or so or less that we actually have all these technologies touching our body, and that's what's different. And as you know from science, it takes us time to catch up to figure out what's going on. And the science communities are really becoming to emerge with better understandings and impacts to the body. But that being common knowledge is lagging. But it's, I used to run research labs and research laboratory work in this, and I need to be statistically significant. And the only way you can be statistically significant with the impact of a cell being damaged by an RF signal is if I take 10,000 children. So I have a plus or minus 5% confidence level, radiate them all, and see what happens in 30 years. We don't have that precision in science. So we collect information as we learn it. We're learning it more and more each day, and it's only been in 2005 we had 30% of the cell phones in the country. All of us had the world actually. By 2015, 99%. There were actually more people with cell phones and toilets in the world. All of a sudden, they're being exposed. Right, Jeff? That's sort of what's going on.
So, Dan, I'm going to have to take a brief musical break here. When we come back, I'll continue talking with Daniel DeBaun about how to limit health risks from EMF exposures, as described in his book, Radiation Nation. Hold on. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today with Daniel DeBaun about his book, Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology and How to Limit Health Risks from EMF Exposures. Our website, Your Own Health and Fitness, has more information about this show and our archive of over 600 shows, a free stream of today's show, and access to our archive of show recordings using our library card feature. To contact us, email us at admin@yourownhealthandfitness.org. And we'll have information on our website about Dan's book, Radiation Nation, and his work. So now, Dan, describe your work in how to protect against EMF exposures.
What you want to do is build products that do shielding for both emissions, the extremely low as well as the RF microwave. Turns out it's a fairly complex engineering problem. We refract, we conduct, and we absorb in technologies we apply, and that third part of the stool, leg of the stool, is you have distance, you have duration, and you have shielding. Think of those all three as ways of protecting yourself. Make sure you stay away from it. If you can't, limit, and if you have to use it, use a shield. I'd like to give you a sort of an analogy that you want to keep in mind about these kinds of things. If you have a room and you have a 1B in that room, that 1B, if it stings you, it won't kill you. You'll be fine. You'll last forever. If you have 1,000 bees, they can kill. So what you want to think about is, if you think of a router as 1B, a cell phone as 3 Bs or 4 Bs, a HP printer as a wireless printer as 5 Bs, your wireless handset for your phone, these are all Bs. All you got to think about is how you reduce the number of Bs. That's how you reduce the number of dangers. If you have a router, you can put it on a timer. You can turn it off and turn it on when you want, anytime, and that downtime is not permeating within the space you're in, and that's a good thing. So as a general rule, think of it as bees in the room.
Before time slips entirely away, there's some issues that I want to make sure that I ask you about. Now, the science of toxic substances generally has a history that, of any toxic substance, has a history something like the following. First, it's assumed that there's no harm, and then there's some science that says, oh, well, there's harm, but it's at a high dose. And then there's some more science after that it says, oh, well, the harm occurs at successively lower doses. And then there's even more science that finally they arrive at, well, really, there's no safe dose. And examples of this are tobacco, lead, air pollution, and ionizing radiation. So the question is that what's happening with EMF and microwave and non-ionizing radiation exposures?
Yeah, actually, Jeff, there is no, when you look at trying to establish in a laboratory an impact of an energy level to a cell, you have to, what you're saying is adjust the level of that, record the impact, and then move on and identify another level and record that. Science has not gotten down to that point yet. So when you ask me about the impact of a Bluetooth versus a cell phone, I can't differentiate the two with justifiable science. So we've not gotten to the point, we've not gotten to the experience level to really be articulate about knowledgeably choosing levels over the other.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. We're still trying to understand the impact to the cell. And by the way, you probably heard, Jeff, of oxidative stress.
Oh, yes.
Oxidative stress is a term you use to say, hey, that cell doesn't like the exposure. I don't like talking about oxidative stress when I talk about electromagnetic radiation because there are many, many impacts, one of which is oxidative stress. The others are impacts to systems of the body. You heard me talk about melatonin before. Well, melatonin, it's the creation of the melatonin that's being impacted, and therefore not creating the melatonin that you need to sleep. So it's the processes within the body that are also being impacted. Immune systems are even being impacted by exposures. And we're just learning to understand this better more recently than ever before.
Essentially what your book is about and what you're trying to communicate to people is a kind of how to do a personal risk assessment. And the question that I have is, could a reasonable person conclude that the safest thing to do is eliminate all exposures from wireless technologies or electronic technologies?
You know, that's a complicated question. The fact is everyone loves their technology. Most of us are not willing to throw it out. So we're not going to abandon it. That's sort of the challenge we have. But to answer your question, actually there are people we know of that actually ask us about how they protect themselves. And they move into the rural environments because they want to protect themselves further from emissions and or they're very, very sensitive, so much so it destroys their lives. So we do know of those who are going to that extreme. But on the average, I think a balance needs to be created. You need to understand the number of bees in the room. You've got to manage that number of bees in the room to a level that reduces those risks. This is a technical detail. When you're in an environment where there's many bees, the federal standard for a cell phone, for example, is 1.6 watts, a power level. If you have a lot of bees, it's a third of that. Typically, your ambience even is not even 0.1, no less 0.5. So you really do want to help drive the number of bees out in the room and then use your technologies in a balanced way, I think is the practical way.
Unless, of course, you're someone like me who is highly allergic to bees so that one bee is one too many in that room. You understand?
And that is actually, you're right. Jeff, you're familiar with electromagnetic hypersensitivity,
yes.
I'm sure. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity is the canary in the coal mine. What we're finding is that there are growing populations of people that are getting more and more damaged by long-term damage by body damage from the emissions they're exposed to, and that falls into the category of electromagnetic radiation.
I'm going to have to pause here for a moment and ID our show, which is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Jeffrey Fawcett. I'm talking today with Daniel DeBaun about his book, Radiation Nation. So please go on. You were talking about electro hypersensitivity.
Yes, and so what we know is there is at least 20% of the global population that is electromagnetic hypersensitive. That is a growth probably over the last 10 years of at least 5%, and we know it's growing. 80% of that segment are women. We know that market, those users are becoming, they're more having negative response to that more so than men for whatever reason. But that's being true. One of the things I need to mention in a sort of a generic sense, electromagnetic radiation is a toxin. when it hits your cell, it's like many other toxins. The body reacts in similar ways from a variety of different sources. I often like to point out, and the way I actually know you're electrically sensitive is I simply ask you if you smell perfume or gas, does it bother you? No.
Yes.
Every time I've asked the question, they say yes.
Yep.
And that's because the cell's a cell, and it's reacting to the toxin, and you are multiply chemically sensitive as well as hypersensitive, electrohypersensitive, which is really interesting. And I don't know if you know Dr. Ali Johansson out of Sweden. He's been leading this work for 30 years. I really consider him one of the leaders in the industry of this subject matter. And he has investigated the mechanical sources of breakdown of the cells. And he's been able to point out what those breakdowns are when cells become weakened. They stop sharing proteins between each other, and you feel like you don't want any more exposure. That's sort of the electromagnetic hypersensitivity model. But he also goes further to say then there is a calcium penetration of the cell, which ultimately leads to mutation and DNA damage. But recently he did a study and released and published what I believe is one of the fairly profound observations that we haven't heard in the marketplace, and since I wrote the book. What he identified the autoimmune system suppression is now existing from electromagnetic radiation. And that makes a lot of sense to us because if you think about it, we have more and more electromagnetic hypersensitive growth. Why? That's why. Our immune systems are being impacted. So I remember I told you it's not the cell individually that we worry about with oxidative stress. We worry about the impact of the systems of the body.
Yes, right, the tissues. On that topic, that's extremely interesting, important information, and it would lead me off into other places. But I want to make sure I ask you the question about what you know about EHS becoming recognized as a disability under legislation such as the American with Disabilities Act. That's a really a great question. I really don't know how long or how much time it will take to get to that space because it's politically driven as much as it's science driven. So, and that's the part about the 35 years before they link cancer to cigarette smoking. It's an environment we all live in that's quite mixed. Ken, I don't know if we have time. Would you want to chat about 5G a little bit? Yes, I did. That was on my list of things to ask about, and I wanted to get, but I was going to get through the electrohypersensitivity. But this kind of fits into where my thought process is going at this point. But one thing that's a very hot political issue, or was recently, although it's going through the state legislature here in California, is facilitating the installation of nodes for 5G and so-called small cell transmitters without review and removing local control. So it's a very hot political issue in California. I'm not sure where it stands in other. I know it's being pushed by industry in other states, and some states have stood up to it and others have not. But the question is, don't those technologies move EMF exposures out of the device and further into the environment? We're not talking just about cell towers or cell antennas. We're talking about transmitters that are every 200 feet is the estimate that they're giving. So that increases our exposures, yes?
The answer is absolutely yes. Let me reinforce. Nationally, from the FCC down, there's been a heavy push, and they're succeeding, where they're taking away the ability of local municipalities to pass or fail approvals of putting cell towers into developments, which is unlike past technologies. So that's clearly different, and they've been successful at the federal level of making that happen, which is really disturbing in a sense that you can have a tower every several hundred feet, which is much more dense than it's ever been before. Now I'd like to talk about what does that mean. And here's the story, a little bit about this. When the standards were created by the FCC 30-some years ago, it was a 6-foot male. It was a guy who occasionally would use a cell phone, and that signal level is 1.6 watts per kilogram. And that same analog signal was for anybody's use, not just 6 foot, but that was the standard at that time that they used. Fast forward to today, we've gone from an analog to a digital signal.
Yeah, and I want to pause here because that's a significant technological change of shifting from analog to digital, and I want listeners to take note of that. That digital adds yet another dimension to the risk of these emissions, these exposures. Anyway, I apologize. Please continue.
Oh, no problem at all. And I think you're right on, Jeff. This is important. And the transition from analog to digital, think of it this way. If I take a 10,000-pound load, put it on a piece of steel, and I put it down on a piece of concrete, and it's a static load, it won't break. It will just stay there, and the concrete will be able to defend. Think of that as the membrane of a cell. Now we come along with 2 to 4G. We're now a digital signal. And what we've done is we've created an on-off, on-off. If I take 10,000-pound load and I put it onto a piece of concrete and I lift it up and put it down and lift it up, put it down, that concrete breaks. That's known as a jackhammer. So the fundamental physical characteristics of impacts to the cell are very different from an analog signal impact, just by the nature of those cells. Now, if you look at between 4G and 5G, remember that the speed of that signal is 10 to 20 times faster than anything that's on the market today. It's up to 60 gigahertz. It's significantly. We're only at around 2 gigahertz now, so it's up to 60 gigahertz. When you get to that speed, it can't go far. So they got to put towers really, really close. That's basically increasing the number of bees in the room. But what's insidious about 5G is it's multiple in, multiple out. That's MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. What that means is if you want to fill your a little pool that you have outside, your kiddie pool with water, Jeff, you'll take a hose and you'll put it out there, and you're going to start filling it out, whatever the tap speed and volume can be. Your wife tells you that's too slow. We want to put the kids in it sooner. So you get another hose, you put another hose to that pool. That's 2 sources. That's MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. So now you don't have 1 jackhammer, you have 2 jackhammers at power energy levels higher than they've ever been. The question is, what's the impact? We don't know. There's not been enough study scientifically, but intuitively, if you look at the track of the technologies that's been evolving from the first generation up to the 4th, we know there's different impacts. And this clearly seems to be on a path of changing that technology to the point where it potentially could be considered a more dangerous to our bodies and our lives.
So the kind of obvious question to me, and I actually don't expect you to have an answer since it kind of violates the distance and time thing, and it's not clear what the shielding might be of how does someone reduce the risks from that technology, that 5G technology.
It turns out that time and distance actually still applies. But the times are smaller and the distances are greater. So it adjusts the model adjusts a bit. And if you're looking for shielding technologies, you got to make sure that they can shield 60 gigahertz. We go up to 30 gigahertz right today. So, but yeah, it changes the precautionary models that we talked about today, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Along those lines of since which 5G is, as I mentioned, the devices are going to get amped up so that they can accommodate this, but the environmental exposure is now going to be great because one of the objectives, stated objectives of promoting 5G is to have availability of this technology everywhere, or as ubiquitous as possible. And so what I want to shift to is another issue which doesn't have to do with, and it is not something that you intended the book for, so this is, I guess, in some sense off topic, but everyone's familiar with the issue of secondhand smoke and how it took a long time for the science to develop around understanding what that is. Well, there's exactly the same issue with these EMF exposures. Even if you're not using a device, if you're in a public place, increasingly you are exposed to other people's devices. And in fact, I remember reading quite some time ago, several years ago, 5 years ago, a study in Japan about what happens in an elevator if people have their cell phones on, and it's there's all this amplification of the signals and whatnot.
Right.
So how do we address that secondhand EMF issue?
Well, first I want to acknowledge that there is virtually no question about it. There is a secondhand EMF concern. And you referred to the elevator. What happens, the cell phone has a problem finding the tower, so it kicks into the highest level of amplitude signal it can, and all of a sudden it's the radiation within that space being confined and having multiple Bs becomes a worse environment. So we don't have good answers for what happens in the future with secondhand. But what I can say is be aware that exists and minimize it as best you can. In other words, if you go into an aircraft that has it, be aware that you're being exposed excessively. Not much you can do. So that environment, there's not much you can do. But at home, if you're being radiated by the RF of a neighbor, which you can't do anything about, and have a second hand, make sure you're far enough away from it where it doesn't bother you. So there are practical steps you may want to think about to try to reduce those kind of exposures, and there are impacts to that.
On that topic, this is a little not off, it's not on the outline, but it prompts me to ask, in an environment such as your own home, are there shielding practices that you can practice that will tamp down on the exposure from things like that? So I know that, for instance, there are metal-based products in all sorts of forms that can be applied to surfaces in order to reduce the exposure. Are those effective at reducing risk?
They are. The paint's 20 to 30%, maybe 40%. They're oxide-based, so that introduces the volatile organic compound concerns. But
yes.
I was talking with an individual yesterday, and they had multiple towers that were less than 200 feet away from the house. And they asked me what they could do. And so I said, get a silver mesh, a conductive material, put it on your drapes, and make sure it's, of course, the side that the source is coming from. And that will reduce it. I've actually seen some of our clients, customers, actually build Faraday cages. They literally line their walls with materials that are conductive. RF is conductive, and then they divert the flow of the RF to a ground and into the 6-foot ground rod. So there are actually things you can do to, if under serious cases you want to fix to some extent, there are actions you can take.
Great.
And then, of course, at the personal level, there are the devices that actually do the shielding. We have products that do that. There are other companies that do that. Be careful when they say they shield you. If there's no laboratory tests, confirmation from an independent third party, and there are claims being made about protection, it really needs to be done by engineers who understand what they're doing. Like for example, Jeff, if you had a grounding pad underneath your feet and you used a cell phone for 5 hours, the grounding pad is marketed as you're safe. But the cell phone goes into the frontal lobe of the head,
yes,
and
right.
as you know, the last 10 years there's been a compounding 2% growth per year to frontal lobe cancers.
Yep.
Glioblastomas,
yes.
Transmit. Yeah, yep. Exactly. And did I tell you about the heart impact? I don't
right,
think
from the NTP study, but the
NTP study.
Yep, yeah. I am afraid that we are entirely out of time. Well, Dan, thanks again for your time today and for your work and for the book.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate you inviting me on. I enjoyed the hour.
Great. Me too. The book is Radiation Nation by Daniel DeBaun and Ryan DeBaun. And we'll have information on our website about Dan's work as well as the book.
You've been listening to Your Own Health and Fitness. Visit our website, yourownhealthandfitness.org, all spelled out, for easy or extended access to our over 600 archive shows with our library card feature, a free stream of this week's show, and lots more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. If you want to reach us, please do so by email, admin, ADMIN, at yourownhealthandfitness.org. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Dr. Jeffrey Fawcett and Lena Berman. Remember, being informed not only protects your health, it protects your freedom.